Hi, everybody. We're going to get started. Hello. Welcome to the Green College Resident Members Series. I'll start by acknowledging that UBC and Green College are on unceded Musqueam territory. My name is Michael, and I'm one of the organizers of the series this year. The Resident Members Series at Green College is a weekly public lecture series in which resident members of the college, all of whom are graduate students or postdocs at UBC, present on a topic related to their research or a topic of interest to them. I'm delighted to introduce this week's speaker. Erin Evans is a first-year PhD student in microbiology and immunology. She was born in the UK and grew up in New Zealand. She has been on a long journey figuring out her autistic brain, and at 27 is passionate about educating others about neurodiversity and proving that society has room for and thrives with all forms of neurotypes. So with that, please join me in welcoming Erin.
Okay. Hello, can everyone hear me okay? Amazing. Okay. So before I get going, I just want to say that any questions you have, I'm happy for you to put your hand up during the presentation or at the end, because I know that inspiration can strike throughout. So I'm going to start it off with a video, and this is from the National Autistic Society in the UK, and it basically was used to kind of describe what it's like to be autistic, and it's not necessarily perfect, but
just wait there 1 minute. I'm just going to get a ticket, okay? Alex, just 1 minute. Okay? 1 minute. Calm down. We're going to go home now, okay? No. Alex, look at me. Focus on me, okay? We're going home. This is me. Breathe. Alex, just breathe. That's it, just keep breathing, calming down. Okay, see everything's fine now? Yeah? Right, let's go home.
So yeah, as we go
I'm
through
not
this
naughty.
presentation,
I'm
that was good. I just want you to keep that in mind. Obviously, it's not the experience 24/7, but that's an idea of what can happen when you kind of become overwhelmed in a situation, especially in a place that is busy like a shopping centre. So sort of an agenda today. So first we're going to look at the background and why thinking about neurodiversity, especially in academia, is important. Next we'll think, what is neurodiversity, what challenges are faced by neurodivergent people, and what assets can neurodivergent people bring. And lastly, how can we make the workplace or academia more accessible to neurodivergent individuals, and sort of the measurable benefits of having neurodiverse teams. So to start off with, who am I? So when I was little, I always felt that there was something different or wrong about me. The way I described it was kind of feeling like an alien looking at this new society that I just didn't quite figure out. I was very much a reader. I read my way through the horrible science book series, which I'm not sure if that's a thing over here, but there was one called Deadly Diseases, and it was my jam. At 14, I told my parents I want to be a microbiologist, and my mum's reaction was like, awesome, okay, what do I do with this? And looking back, there are many signs that I was autistic, but the people around me didn't have the language or the understanding to sort of like prescribe that to me, and so I was just kind of described as just Erin. That's just how Erin is. Now I'm a PhD student here at UBC in Microbiology and Immunology, so, you know, I've completed that part at 14. I've always thrived academically, but I've always struggled on the social side and the executive functioning of life. And going to university and entering the workplace was a particular challenge for me because those support systems, i.e. my mum, were gone and less able to sort of support me, although she did support me from afar. I sort of self-diagnosed as autistic at around 21, and I now know that I'm much happier when I'm able to work with my brain instead of against it. So, who cares? About 1 in 5 people are neurodiverse, so that's a good proportion of the people in this room. And some statistics, so employees with ADHD are 60% more likely to be fired from a job, which I think is like just kind of hard to think about. Just 22% of autistic people are in employment, and this is compared to 80% of non-disabled people, but also 47% of disabled people. So it's almost even more difficult for autistic people to get in the workplace. And this is despite the fact that 77% of unemployed autistic adults want employment. So it's not as if people don't want to be employed, they just can't get those jobs. And something that might be contributing this is the idea that 72% of organizations don't consider neurodiversity in their organization's people management practices or hiring practices. It's just not thought about. Okay, so why now? We are in a room of future employers, hiring committees, group leaders, teachers, parents, mentors, and I want you to have this information to carry with you forward because we're that next generation who's going to be providing the workplace for our neurodivergent individuals. And inherently, neurodiversity is a hidden disability, and individuals are often very good at hiding it. And lastly, academia is attractive to neurodivergent people. You get to study in depth, like something that you're really, really interested in, and nobody's going to laugh at you because it's your job. It's a lot more flexible environment, and you're often encouraged to be slightly weird or different. So neurodiversity refers to a diversity in human brain and cognition across the population. So there's something called the neurodivergent umbrella, which kind of includes many, many different changes that can happen to the brain. It's a non-exhaustive list. There's no defined term. It did start out initially with just autism, but then it's grown and grown. There are some that you might consider to be more pathological. So, for example, OCD or schizophrenia, which causes actual sort of issues for that individual person. And then there's some that are more just kind of inherently brain differences, like autism or ADHD. But all of these individuals share these differences in thinking, processing, and communication. And often it might results in a range of symptoms, obviously. But these can particularly relate to executive functioning. So we've got self-control or the ability to sort of like manage one's emotions, being able to be flexible. I'll answer at the end of this slide. Starting a task, organizing those tasks, and planning and time management. Yes?
I'm sort of curious about epilepsy.
Yeah, I think it is still a brain change. And so I think that's why it's included in this. But you do end up with this kind of spectrum from maybe more medical to less pathologized. Sort of, but I get into that more later. So just to give you more of an idea of neurodiversity across the population. So here we've got 100 little stick figures. So of the global adult population, About 10% are dyslexic, 6% are dyspraxic, 5% have ADHD, 1 to 2% are autistic, 1% have Tourette's, and then the remaining 85% are what we call neurotypical, which is you don't fit under this neurodivergent umbrella, your brain is, in inverted commas, considered normal. And this doesn't add up to 100%, and that's because many neurodivergencies coexist. So a big one I had growing up, and well, not just growing up, but as an adult was, but you don't look autistic. To which I say, well, what does that look like? But our diagnostic criteria is based on young, white, male children from affluent families. Hans Asperger's was a eugenicist. We don't like to associate ourselves with him anymore, but basically he came up with what he called his little Einsteins, which was trying to separate autistic kids that could be economically useful to the world and those who couldn't. And that's just a really horrific way to look at something. And we're only realizing now that neurodiversity presents differently in women and non-binary people. So, for example, the average age at diagnosis for autism and ADHD for little boys is 5, and for girls is 11. And obviously, we don't have data yet for non-binary people, but anecdotally out there, you know. And also, there's many women who don't get diagnosed until they're in their 30s, until their children get diagnosed with it, and they go, that rings a lot of bells. And it's important, I think, to have this diagnosis, because otherwise you end up what I went through, which was a lot of, why is everything about me wrong? Why is my brain not working the way that other people's are? And you kind of get into this cycle, and then once you realize it, you go round and round in circles, trying to stop masking because that's what's protected you for so many years, and wanting to be your authentic self, but then struggling because you revert back to that masking. And so I want to look at the social model of disability. Now, I'm a scientist. I work in the lab. I don't necessarily work a lot with people. But the social model of disability is this idea that the stereotypes and misconceptions are harmful and invalidating to people who live with daily struggles as a result of their neurodivergence. And a lot of this is due to the inaccessibility of society. And this is in contrast to the medical model. So this little cartoon, I think, sums it up quite well. The square's like, no, you need to become all squares. And the circles are like, why don't we just change it so everyone can fit through? So the medical model suggests that there's something wrong with the individual, and the social model saying, no, there's something wrong with society. And so, yeah, just looking at this sort of graphic, you can see on the right, it's the medical model, and it's very much, there's something wrong with that person. You can't walk, you can't see, you can't work. Whereas if we look at it socially, we say, well, no, we're not providing lifts for those people. We're not providing them with a visual and hearing world so that people who are deaf or blind can experience it. And we're not helping these people get into work so they can work. So a little bit more of these harmful misconceptions. I'm sure you guys must have heard this before. Everyone's a little bit autistic. Just read faster. I'm so OCD, I have to line up all my pens. This is one I got a lot, you're too much. And things like, you can't be X, you can make eye contact. You can write essays. You can pay attention. Or you don't make weird noises. You don't wash your hands all the time. So by distilling these neurodivergencies into single stereotypes, it can really harm it, because if you don't fit into that, people don't see and then don't accept or take into consideration your neurodivergence. So to go into this a little bit more, especially on the autistic spectrum. So the autistic spectrum is not linear. It's a lovely circle. So there's many different traits that result of how the brain is functioning. And some people might find those skills harder than others. And you can kind of end up with this map. And on the right, what I'm going to show now is mine. So as you can see, I struggle quite a lot with noise sensitivity and sort of like sitting wrong. So I'll kind of gremlin, which is not good for posture. But for example, like I can make eye contact, mainly because I was taught to, as a child, to make eye contact. And sometimes it's intense. I used to have like aggression when I was younger, which I don't have so much anymore. Tics and fidgets are really helpful when you have a fidget toy. So if you can play with this, and you're welcome to come up and play with it after. But this profile will look different for every autistic individual, and I think that's really important to look at how it affects the individual. But then also we can have accessibility in place that is helpful for everyone. And if you happen to be autistic and you'd like to find out your own profile, you can go to idrlabs.com. They're like an actual research group. No, okay. So neurodivergent traits are human traits. It's just ours are a bit more extreme. So looking at this, neurotypical traits tend to be this kind of brown bit in the middle, and then you'll have some extremes, but then you take a neurodivergent individual and suddenly you've got these extremes. And what it creates is this spiky profile. So in the orange, you've got a neurotypical individual, and on the left, when I say skills, I don't mean sort of above average or below average on a population level, I mean on an individual level. So most neurotypical people will have a very similar ability for different skills. So for example, I've put verbal skills, processing speed, etc. Like they'll all be on a similar level, and it helps you stay very level. Whereas neurodivergent people can be wildly high on one aspect and then wildly low on another. And you end up with this spiky profile. And that's why I think people can get confused, because they'll say like, oh, but you're really good at writing essays. Why can't you process when I'm talking to you? And you're like, because I can't process the talking to you, but I can write an essay, I can bang it out, you know? So this next slide, I will show it at the end as well when there's questions, so you can have a little better look at it. Basically, it says for each of these 6 neurodivergencies on the screen, so say what you might struggle with and what your possible strengths would be. And this is the same for neurotypical people as well. We all have our strengths and weaknesses. Sometimes when your weaknesses are really weak, people will tend to focus on that more than your strengths. And sometimes your strengths can be bits that people don't normally come across. So they're like, well, why would that be a strength? So I will show this at the end. I'll let the people take a photo if they wish. Yes, Layla. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So about self-diagnosis is what I struggled for a long time. I was like, well, and in the NHS, the waiting list is about 4 years long, and it's inaccessible, and even in countries that, like even in the US or Canada, it's expensive, and there's long waiting lists. And there's not a test for it, you know? And it's not as if there is a drug that I can take that would magically fix my brain. So one, there's no harm in self-diagnosis, and actually the benefits outweigh the potential cons of taking space away from autistic people. I think another aspect is, I've heard is that people like, well, if you've been thinking about this and obsessing about this for 2 years, you're probably autistic. So yeah, we can get more into it later. So this is the last little bit of my agenda. So improving accessibility to the workplace. So it's 1, getting in, 2, staying in, and 3, playing to our strengths. So a story from me is that before I was here at Green, I was working in industry. We did antibody production in Cambridge in the UK. And I was slowly dying a corporate life. And it just didn't seem to be working for whatever reason. And going into the job, part of me, I knew that statistic, about 22% of autistic people, only 22% of autistic people work. And I thought, well, that won't be me, because like I have the skills and everything's fine. And then I got into the job and realized quickly that things weren't necessarily fine. And I was struggling with my mental health, and it wasn't really being acknowledged at work because I kind of seemed fine until I suddenly wasn't. And people were like, whoa, where did this come from? And so what actually helped is I talked to the social team at the campus, and I said, hey, I'd like to do a seminar on basically what I'm doing now, neurodivergence. And they were like, awesome, sounds good. They didn't have many social activities then. And to my surprise, I remember like all the companies came, and there were some companies who left saying, we're going to change our hiring practices. And there was my manager also saying, oh, he was 43. He was like, oh, I've realized that I'm neurodivergent. And I was like, oh, awesome. Like, I'm so glad that I could help you figure that out. And because I had had that talk, there was almost a shift, and there was more people who understood perhaps the way my brain worked. And even though nothing at work had actually changed in terms of my workload, because I felt more accepted and more understood, I'm not going to say it improved, like, I'm still here, I still left, but it improved drastically from where I was. And so, yeah, we'll get into... So basically, anyone who is qualified, skilled, or valuable to your team should be included and accommodated. And accommodations can be useful for everyone. So, for example, for neurodivergent people, it makes the workplace accessible when it might otherwise not be. And it can reduce this pressure on executive functioning skills, flexible working. So being able to choose where you're working, when you're working, within reason of the sort of the workplace. It might allow the individual to work during quieter times when there's less distraction. But it also benefits neurotypical people. For example, parents or caregivers. Allows people to do everyday errands. For example, dentists are not always open on the weekend. So if you could go at like 1 till 2 p.m. on a Monday, amazing. You can work at times that suit your circadian rhythm. We all know a night owl, and you can get a better life balance. And this also benefits the organization through increased productivity, better job satisfaction, it attracts talent, and it reduces sick absences. And as much as I don't like to necessarily pander to the capitalistic mindset that we must all be productive, we live in a world where we have to work to get money to live our lives. So we might as well enjoy and be happy in our work. So first bit, getting in. I don't know if you've ever... I don't know if you've ever applied for sort of supermarket jobs. They have a screening questionnaire online. My mum used to have to sit behind me and sort of gently shake her head when the answer I had chosen was wrong. She'd be like, no, Erin, don't do that one. Do another one. I'd be like, oh, this one? Yes. Because she noticed that I just wasn't getting the jobs. And she was like, this is ridiculous. You should be getting the jobs. Like, this is to work at McDonald's. This is achievable for you. Obviously, there's less of that when you're in higher sort of education-style jobs. First of all, we have the advert. with non-essential requirements, such as, and these non-essential requirements might be ambiguous, such as, great team player, I don't know what that means. Or irrelevant ones, such as an IT person who works on coding in the background being an excellent communicator. You know, you could be an adequate communicator and be absolutely fine. And ways to get around this is to be specific with your language, avoid unnecessary jargon, having an ED and I statement, which I know that a lot of companies do have, but they tend to miss out neurodiversity. And then also another aspect could be objective assessments, if that's something that works in your field. Then next is the interview. So part one of this is an understanding. So the understanding that the person might have no or intense eye contact. They might be very literally thinking. They might be too truthful. For example, when somebody asks, what are your weaknesses? Don't say I'm really bad at timekeeping. Difficulty reading social cues, and difficulty with tone, either themselves or understanding the interviewer's tone. And modifications to interviews that can be made is to minimize distractions, add breaks, provide questions and tasks in advance, allowing extra time for those tasks, but also processing time for the questions, and to, again, be specific. So this is sort of harking back to what I said previously, but most organizations focus a lot on CVs and interviews. This places a big focus on what people have been doing in the past and their social skills or their ability to sell their skills in an interview setting. In many cases, however, social skills may not even be crucial for the role. For example, you may risk turning down a brilliant data analyst for the lack of a skill that isn't even relevant to the role. And this was the CEO of Auticon, which is this company that basically specifically hires autistic individuals to do their IT development. So when we also, next if we go to sort of staying in, thinking about accommodations, this can be different for every individual. So I've come up with some that have helped me or friends. You might find one on there that is useful to you. What I particularly like is having written communication. I'm not very good at processing things through like hearing. Having an understanding of neurodiversity throughout the organization. And also another one that helped was mentoring or buddying up. When I was at my workplace, I found a great friend who would tell me when I had been a little bit blunt in meetings. And we would laugh about it, and it made me feel better because she helped me understand the situations where I could have been a little bit more neurotypical, but also accepting that that was the way my brain worked. So I've also got here some quotes or statements from massive companies around the world. So the first one is that 20 to 30% of employers stated they would be uncomfortable employing or managing somebody with neurodivergent conditions, which is really ruling out a massive, 20% of your hiring workforce. Forbes explained that diverse and inclusive cultures are providing companies with a competitive edge over their peers. And organizations that are seeking to become more inclusive and get the best out of an increasingly diverse workforce need to focus on people's strengths rather than what they can't do, which makes sense for anybody. You need to create a space where people feel safe being themselves. If you're feeling that you have to mask yourself at work, whether you're neurotypical or neurodivergent, it can make you feel really exhausted and you're prone to burnout. Neurodiverse teams are up to 30% more productive. So these are teams that might contain some neurotypical people, some autistic people, some dyslexic people, and groups them together because you're creating people who have lots of different strengths and weaknesses, and they can balance it out. If you just had a team of autistic people, that's not neurodiverse. And then this last one is in the correct environment, autistic people are 48 to 140% more productive than their peers, which I think is amazing, but it has this very big caveat of it has to be the correct environment. And sometimes we're not willing to create that correct environment. And because I just don't want to talk about how this can be beneficial to capitalism, etc., I want to talk also about the knock-on effects to the individual. And this can be very hard to quantify. I tried to look for statistics, and they're very far and few between. But basically, from my personal experience, I've found that accepting my neurodivergence and finding spaces that accept and celebrate this. For example, at Green, where being very interested in your topic is celebrated and talking about COVID over the dinner table is very much okay. But also the lab, where again, I can talk about that with other scientists. This has led to, personally, better mental health, better relationships, and a sense of finding my place in the world, which I think is very important for anybody. And I think is especially cool given I started out little Erin thinking, oh my God, I'm an alien, I don't belong here. So yeah, and with that, I will leave you on this slide and open to any questions.
Thank you, Erin. That was fantastic. I'm going to pass around a microphone for questions, so just catch my eye and raise your hand, and I'll pass it around. So we can start with Evan.
Thank you so much for bringing neurodiversity and calling it out. I think one of the questions that I have around invisible disabilities and people living with disabilities as myself is the concept of disclosure. And I would love to hear more about how you think of disclosure around invisible neurodivergency disability in spaces where you might feel safe, unsafe, or when sometimes you're coerced into disclosing that information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so definitely there's like the legal side of it that I won't get into because I know we have many lawyers at Green. But at least my experience in the UK is it's a protected condition, and this idea that you can't discriminate based on it. However, that doesn't always happen. I think it's always important to be as safe as you can be and whatever you feel comfortable in. However, there are certain situations where you think, oh, okay, maybe I can just make this all go away by disclosing an invisible disability. So it can definitely be hard, and it's definitely up to the individual. And I think my hope is that with more awareness around invisible disabilities, such as neurodivergence, but other ones as well, that we will just become more accepting as a society for these different conditions and the different ways in people might experience the world. Does that help? Okay.
Hi, Erin.
Hi.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being vulnerable with us and for sharing your story as well. I had a question about Autism Speaks and the whole thing, this narrative behind curing autism. As a researcher, as a scientist, how do you cope with that with other researchers or organizations looking to cure neurodivergencies rather than supporting?
Yeah. So on the Autism Speaks, many autistic people do describe it as a hate group and have sort of shunned their symbols and everything they stand for. A big part is that their funding doesn't actually go into helping autistic people. And I think a big thing for me is that their board and their employees, basically nobody is autistic, which I think is very important to have in an autistic society. And I'm glad that the UK has our much better version. It is, sometimes as a researcher, I can go through people, I'll go onto a researcher's page and read through about their research, and they might be looking into the causes behind autism and very occasionally cure, although that's kind of phasing out. And it can be hard because, one, I think there's many other diseases out there that are a bit more deadly and debilitating. And two, it almost makes, it's funny because science is actually a place where it's very accepting of neurodivergence in general. But then you have these individuals who, through no malice to be fair, but it's slightly misguided. I hope more that we can move towards, I guess, looking at autism from a social perspective rather than a medical perspective. However, I can, as a researcher, understand why people want to get down to the cause of something. But also just because we figured out the cause, I don't think necessarily we need to fix it. So one that I think would be related to that is Down syndrome, which is under this neurodivergent umbrella, which is this idea of we know exactly what causes Down syndrome. Should we get rid of it? And, I would argue no, because you talk to anyone who has experience with living with somebody with Down syndrome and they're like, my life and their life is better for it. And it's not it is a disability, but it's only disability because of the world we live in. So, yeah.
Well said.
Thanks, Erin, for your presentation. Some of the research that we do in our lab focuses on the peer relationships of kids with ADHD, and we know that they experience a lot of issues in terms of their relationship with peers, whether that's peer rejection, whether that's having less friends and friendships of lesser quality. And I guess an encouraging thing that's happening is that the interventions that people are putting forward are moving away from this idea of fixing individuals, of trying to teach kids social skills, and rather addressing the perceptions that peers have of kids with ADHD. And I know this is not specifically related to autism, but I'm curious to your thoughts on what do you think would be helpful supports or resources that might be beneficial for kids who might not fully understand, their condition and might be struggling with making friends and just peers and navigating all of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there was actually a really interesting study that was published a couple of years ago now, which took pairs of people. So they had matched autistic pairs, matched non-autistic pairs, and then a mixed pair. Mm-hmm. And they found that communication was perceived from an outsider to be better in those autistic pairs. And it's kind of going towards, there used to be this notion that autistic people have a deficit in communication, and this did spread to other neurodivergencies. But what this paper was saying, there are other papers, was basically this idea of no, the communication is just different. And so I think what can be helpful is potentially, putting kids who have ADHD or other neurodivergencies together, not necessarily to, hide them away from the world, but as support groups, play groups, because then they have that mix of, I'm in a place where I feel I belong, and then, I also go to school and I have a few friends and maybe I find it a bit hard, but when I'm at this play group, I feel I can be myself. I think another aspect is the parents having education and being able to give the kids a reason, maybe, because I didn't have a reason when I was little why I didn't have friends. And actually, I think it really confused my mum as well. She was like, I don't understand. You're lovely. And I was like, well, you're a bit biased, Mum. And because I didn't struggle making friends, I struggled with the keeping of the friends. Because as I became more comfortable with my friends, I would unmask, and the kind of little monster would kind of come out, and people would be like, what? So I think it'd be helpful for, the parents and the adults around that kid to be like, hey, like, to change things when it's wrong, when that kid might be doing something they don't realize could affect that relationship, kind of stepping in, especially with the young kids, and saying like, oh, hey, like, they might not necessarily like that. Why don't we do this instead so you can maintain that relationship? And then when they're older, maybe they come to you with problems and you can be like, okay, that's not how I would address the problem, but let's try and work out how we can face it together. So I think generally just with more society awareness, and also the hope that those kids will grow up and become much more secure in themselves, as we all become.
Thanks.
No worries.
I see Zach's hand, and was there another hand over here? Okay, we'll go to Zach, and then we'll go here.
I had a question just in terms of the disparate rates of diagnosis on gender grounds. Because I was thinking about this in terms of, as a queer person and understanding gender as a social construct. So when we find that, autistic, in terms of at least its early symptoms, displays differently between younger boys and girls, is that along the lines of, younger boys and girls are socially they're socially expected to behave in certain ways, and so that's how it outwardly displays itself? Or is there an actual difference in terms of how it displays itself between those of XX chromosomes and XY chromosomes?
I think it's definitely the social aspect of it, because girls are expected to have much bigger friendship groups, have better social skills at a much younger age. And for me, my social skills were definitely behind. I think they were behind my female friends, but probably in line with my male friends. And so, yeah, I think it is the way we treat boys and girls. I think thinking about ADHD, boys are more likely to be hyperactive and girls are more likely to be inattentive. But again, that could be due to the social idea that boys are allowed to run around and be crazy more than girls societally. Whereas girls are expected to sit down, so that's the way it presents.
Thank you.
Oh, God.
Hello, thank you for your presentation this evening. My story is similar to what you mentioned earlier on in your presentation, that I was diagnosed when my son was. He was 6, I was 42. And what I have found the hardest in the corporate world is people not understanding movement, that you need to move. And so just in the last 18 months, I was called rude from one of my colleagues because I got up to get a glass of water while we were talking at a meeting, and the meeting was in the kitchen. And so the expectations that you'll never move, you'll always sit still, you'll always make eye contact is so unrealistic. And so I had to take this issue up to the CEO level and the CEO, and that's when I finally unmasked. So that person apologized and has been super gracious ever since. It's a shame that it took that. At the same time, what I'm finding is if I announce it at the beginning of a committee, if I'm on a committee or I'm with a new group of people and I announce, I want to let you all know I'm neurodivergent, ADHD, I move a lot, I'm excited about everything's shiny and new, I want to celebrate, and I might be a little bit overwhelming. I try to give them a little heads up. Mm-hmm. I've not to this day had one person say, tell me more about that. Mm-hmm. How can I support you? How can I make sure you're going to be successful while you're on this committee? I find that really disturbing myself. Yeah. The other thing is I'm curious what your thoughts are in all your scientific research. We've got the medical profession saying this is an inherited through our DNA, through our parents and such. And then we have Dr. Gabor Mate out here, who is a clinical psychologist, saying that ADHD comes from trauma. Mm-hmm. I'm curious how you feel about this.
So this ties quite nicely, actually, to my research. So my research is surrounding MS and the causes behind it. And MS is what we call a multifactorial disease. So there's not just one cause. There's genetic factors, there's environmental factors, and we don't know all the factors, and that's what my research is going into. So I think it can be quite reductionist to look at neurodivergencies, which involve the brain, which we still don't know a lot about, to put it down just to genetics or to trauma or the environment, or, you know, because the environment can include things from the environment when you're in your mother's womb all the way to childhood environment, adult, and it's really hard to separate those things when you have a person in their 40s with MS. And so I think that's why I like to look at it from more of a social aspect. I understand why people want to figure out the cause, but I think there's more important things out there to research. But yeah, also going back to how you were saying that people didn't ask, and I think that can come from a place of perhaps being uncomfortable, perhaps they don't know what to do in that situation. And that's why I think it can be really helpful to be out, for lack of a better word, and talking about it to lots of different people, to kids, to the workplace. Being autistic, I don't really care about hierarchy, so I will just talk about it to anyone. I don't care if you're the CEO of a company, I will talk to you about it, and I did. And yeah, it's like the more we know about it, the more we can support people. But yeah, and because it's very individual, it is important to ask the individual, how can we help you? And also movement is good for everybody. Get the blood pumping.
Cool. Thank you so much, Erin. That was very thought-provoking, and I may have done some self-diagnosis right now. But I had a question about the umbrella of neurodivergence, if you can go back to that. Kind of similar to what Amanda said, and also jumping off of the question about trauma and ADHD. I guess I'm wondering at what point is something categorized as neurodivergent versus a different sort of neurological condition, and if that's related at all to things that you're quote unquote born with versus that develop. Because I was kind of surprised to see PTSD and CPTSD there, but also surprised that, for example, Parkinson's isn't there. Things like that. It's
yeah. So I think sometimes I struggle with this of something that is just the way your brain works and is not inherently pathological. And yeah, conditions such as PTSD, which are definitely, you might be more prone to it, but there has to be an environmental aspect, and it's definitely pathological because it causes that person such anxiety and stress. However, I don't think it takes anything away from it, including those groups under the neurodivergent umbrella, especially because the result in thinking, processing, communication is the same. And I mean, all of them are their own sort of individual research aspects. Sorry, what was the second part of your...
I think just things that kind of develop later on, for example, Parkinson's.
Yeah.
Why that isn't.
So my guess is that it doesn't affect the person for a massive part of their life. I think things like epilepsy, OCD, tic disorders, PTSD generally occur childhood, early adulthood, so that person does have to live with that condition for the majority of their life, whereas maybe things like Parkinson's are a bit more later life, so it's considered more in the old age thing. But yeah, not entirely sure, and it's a developing field.
Thank you so much, Erin, for this lovely talk. It is fantastic, and I've learned so much. I, last year, worked as a tutor, and as a nature of that job, worked with a lot of neurodivergent kids, just because they needed extra support. And just listening to this, I was realizing that I always received information about their neurodivergency either from their parents or from school counselors. And very rarely did I have any kids tell me themselves and then be able to articulate ways that I could support them. But I would never bring it up with them because a lot of the times I think that they didn't know that I knew. Yeah. And so I was wondering if you have any recommendations on how to broach these conversations with people in a way that is like very respectful.
Yeah. So some parents don't want to label their kids. And I think that was almost part of it for my parents. They didn't necessarily want to take me along to a doctor because they didn't think anything was wrong, but also two, they were like, well, if something is wrong, we don't want to label her. However, I think labels can be very helpful to people who want them. They can help provide you with a framework of how your body works. So my sister is a teacher and she works with quite young kids, and she, is aware of their neurodivergencies. They're about 8, so they can't necessarily describe it in those words, but at the same time, at 8, I was articulating, I feel different, I feel like I don't belong. I would love schools to have neurodivergency sort of as part of their curriculum, like, talking about in the umbrella of talking about physical and mental health and all these aspects that can be really important information for young kids that I didn't get, and I think a lot of people in this room didn't get, but we can definitely try to give to the kids. And also because it means that they can discuss it with their friends, and if their friends are like, oh, why do you never look me in the eye, or why do you never want to go on to this slide? And then that can be like, oh, well, the slide makes my ears hurt, so I don't want to do it. And that friend will be like, okay, cool, like, we'll just go play on this other thing, because kids are very malleable, right? They're very easily persuaded to do something else. So yeah, again, more communication and just more positive about it, because I think we've had a lot of negative.
Hi. I don't know how this is going to turn into a question.
That's okay.
Okay. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the now like debunked, or I don't know if it was ever official, subcategory of Asperger's. Because I remember when that was a big deal, and I think it's kind of created this stereotype that a lot of autistic people are like secretly like geniuses. And we've talked about my sister before, who is autistic and is not a secret genius. And I was wondering if you had any more thoughts on like thinking about the workplace. Like my sister has applied for jobs where every time there's somebody who just has like another skill that she doesn't have, like I don't know the legality of this, but like I guess they're saying she's not being discriminated against because like she doesn't have any like of the special skills and other people have more skills. So she can't find a job. But she needs a job for her mental health. So like what are the incentives under capitalism for an organization? Sorry, that was like such a grad student question, or like undergrad, I don't know. But like what are the like ways of solving that? Like how do you give people a job?
So going on the Asperger's, I know that it no longer exists in the UK, and I believe that mostly worldwide it's been replaced with support levels. So support levels 1, 2, and 3. 3 being the most support required, 1 being the least support required. Let's bear in mind that doesn't mean no support required at any point. As for entering the workplace, I think employers need to be okay with people not having all the skills. It's like they want the big, massive cake, and they can't accept just a slice, when a slice will do exactly the same job. I don't know. I wish I could solve it, Like, I wish we could just give people jobs. Like, there's enough jobs out there for people to have. And also, sort of, one person doesn't have to do it all. One person, if they could be really good at data entry. just give them data entry and pay them for it. Often, I guess, these people have other support systems in their life. Actually, a really cool initiative, my sister's, she went to St Andrews University in Scotland, and they had a cafe that was only, they only employed neurodivergent people, and it tended to be the higher support levels required, and I think that's awesome, because you don't have the public kind of coming to a restaurant or cafe and expecting neurotypical people when a neurodivergent person comes along, or a person with disabilities. I think there can be sometimes a bit of shock because you're not expecting it in that situation. Whereas if you go to a cafe where it proudly displays, we employ neurodivergent people, then, you know, people can go there, they also feel good, you know, through this sort of charitable aspect of it, which, you know, is a bit infantilizing sometimes, but if it gets the job done of hiring neurodivergent people in these ways, I think that can only be a good thing. Because again, you're helping mental health, their autonomy, life skills. Yeah. I think.
We have time for one more question. I'm curious if there are any. Oh, yes.
I'm also happy to stay behind
yes,
and answer.
We're going to wrap up at 9. Erin,
Yeah.
it will stay, and I'll just give the microphone to maybe give a non-resident a chance.
Hi, Erin. Thanks so much for this talk. Really appreciated it. I'm Raina. I'm a GC alum from some time ago. I wonder if I could bring you back to that slide with the circle of thought bubbles that was sort of describing this realization. Yes.
That one? Yeah.
So here, and also in the bit about the difference between the social model and the medical model, there are really, really strong resonances between neurodivergent experience and the experience of people with trans identities.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it is eerie how similar that little thought wheel is, and when it comes to the fraught and conflicted relationship with like a diagnostic label, that's also something that is, I think, very familiarly understood. And it seems like there is something going on here, in as much as I think we're coming to understand that there's a really high degree of overlap between trans people and people with autism.
Oh, yeah.
And I guess, you know, without asking you to speculate about identities that you may or may not have, just like from your perspective as a person with an autistic brain, right? Like, do you think that there are qualities about it that might, you know, go some of the way to explaining why that overlap is so high, about how brains that work in this way think about their own gender and gender in society?
I think there's two parts of it. One is this sort of non-conforming, not necessarily being aware that they should conform to society until later in life. And the second bit is, I forgot it. Being, like, I guess one part of it is like accepting that your brain works differently and kind of almost leaning into that and saying, well, okay, maybe I should question these other things that are happening. But yeah, there's definitely this overlap between, not just trans, but also queer people and being autistic and sort of like not fitting into society's heteronormative, et cetera, experience. So yeah, that's my thoughts.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Thanks.
All right, we're going to end there. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Erin's going to stick around.